Hello and welcome to a lecture over Chapter 5, The Principles of Design. In this chapter we will be discussing the principles of design, which are unity and variety, balance, emphasis, proportion and scale, and rhythm. So when we talk about the principles of design, we are talking about how the elements of art are arranged in a work. So all of the artworks that we look at, for the most part, in a museum or in an art book, will have a sense of wholeness, a sense of rightness, and these principles of design are going to help us explain why it feels that way. Now, just keep in mind that there are no absolute rules for design, but these principles kind of set guidelines for artists. I'm going to divide this lecture into 5 parts. The first part will be the principles of design, unity, and variety. When we're talking about unity and variety, we talk about them in the same sentence because they really work together. When we're talking about unity, we're talking about this sense of oneness or a coherent whole. Variety, on the other hand, will be difference to create interest, so any kind of different elements of art. They have to work together because if you have an artwork that is entirely unified, it's going to be pretty bland. So in other words, it would be something like a canvas that had one color on it. Okay, so it's not going to hold interest very long. It's going to be pretty bland. Now, on the other hand, if you have something that's just completely filled with variety, it's going to be chaotic. So in other words, you're not going to have anything that's repeated. So we'd have all different colors, all different shapes, all different lines, all different everything. And it would be kind of hard to look at because of that. So most artwork is going to fall somewhere in the middle, and it's not going to be either all unified or all variety. So in this piece, Black Face and Arm Unit by Ben Jones from 1971, we will be looking at how the artist is using these principles, so how he is using variety and unity. So what we're looking at here is a three-dimensional artwork that is hung on the wall, and you can see we have several plaster casts of faces above a plaster cast of arms in different positions. So we can safely say that we have some things that are repeated here. So first of all, we have shape, which is an element of art, and shape is going to be a unifying element here. We have organic shape in the form of arms and faces. We also have line. If you'll notice, within each separate unit, you have all different types of line. You have horizontal, vertical, diagonal, you have implied line, you have actual line, just about every other kind of line that you can think of. So what that does is it creates variety because we have different types of line. That being said, however, because each unit has line in it, that is also a unifier. So sometimes something that is creating variety can also create unity. So that's why we talk about these as being very closely related. We also have space as an important element here. If you look at the way he has arranged them on the wall, you'll notice that each unit is placed the same amount of space apart. And so that is definitely going to be a unifying element because they are all the same distance apart. That helps create a visual rhythm or a visual wholeness, a unity within the piece. Looking at this piece, this is interior of a Dutch house from 1658 by Pieter de Hoek, and So alongside this idea of visual unity, we have conceptual unity, which means unity through ideas. Joseph Cornell is an artist who uses this idea frequently in his work. This is The Hotel Eden from 1945. So in it we have a lot of disparate objects. We have this cutout of a parrot right in the center. We have a yellow ball in the upper right-hand corner and this sort of spiraling object in the upper left-hand corner, along with some sort of clippings in the background with white paint that's been splattered on them. So when you think about these objects in the real world, you'll notice that they don't really have any sort of connection. But what he does is he places them all in this framework of this box, which helps unify the objects, along with this visual unity that we have through the repetition of rectangles and squares and the color white and the color yellow, which makes us feel like they must have some sort of connection, and it's kind of up to the viewer to come up with that connection in his work. So his work is all about dreams and fantasy, nostalgia. It's very surrealistic. And so it will kind of conjure up different concepts to different people. When I look at it, I kind of think of this bird and its habitat playing a game with the string and the ball. And for me, it's more of a kind of an upbeat, kind of dreamlike piece. This ends the first section of Chapter 5. In the next section, we will begin by discussing the principle of design balance. This is the second section of Chapter 5, the Principles of Design, in which we'll be discussing balance. When we talk about art, there are two different types of balance we discuss. We discuss physical balance and visual balance. Physical balance is going to be referring to three-dimensional artworks as well as kinetic artworks. And then visual balance is a little bit harder to explain. It's going to be the result of balancing visual weights on either side of an imaginary axis. So we're going to talk in depth about visual balance in this section of the lecture. So the piece that we're looking at here is Red Cube by Isamu Noguchi from 1968. And we're looking at a photograph of it in an outside plaza, and it looks like the sculpture is in front of some sort of office building with lots of windows. When we're looking at the sculpture itself, it's this red cube that's kind of up on its point, and we can tell that this is physically balanced because it's not moving, it's not rolling down the hill or anything, and then it's also symmetrical, which means it's even, it's equal on either side of an imaginary axis. So if we were to divide the sculpture down the middle, it would be a mirror image on either side. So the sculpture we know is both visually and physically balanced. Now, if we look at the image on your screen as a photograph, and we talk about it as a photograph, it's not symmetrical, right? So we have the red cube that's kind of offset on the right side, and that is then visually balanced against the background information on the left side. So you have this really bright, bold, solid red. That's very simple and plain against the patterning of all of the repeated rectangles on the left-hand side. You can also see that we have some letters that are done in white that are that create a high contrast, which can also create visual weight. So you can see an object or an artwork does not have to be symmetrical to be visually balanced. So in this artwork, we're going to be discussing both symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. This is Deer Skull with Pedernal by Georgia O'Keeffe from 1936. In this work, we have both symmetry, which remember is where we have a mirror image, and then we have asymmetry. So if we look at, first of all, the focal point of this painting is the deer skull. And you can see if you divide that right down the middle, it's going to be pretty symmetrical from left to right. It's not perfectly symmetrical, and very rarely in art or in nature will you see perfect symmetry. But when it's that close, we will refer to that as being symmetrical. And then that is used in conjunction with this asymmetrical balance that's happening in the middle ground and in the background of the painting. So if we start at the bottom of the painting and look at the background, you'll notice that we have this mountain that looks like it's very far away. And then right above that, we have a white stick that's kind of shooting off the larger, darker tree. As you move up, you get to the skull, and then move further up, and you'll see that the tree continues and kind of bends to the right-hand side. So if we divide it right down the painting, right down the middle, you'll notice that the mountain and the lighter white stick are on the bottom left, and then the darker, bigger part of the stick kind of curves off to the right at the upper right-hand side. So this is actually balanced asymmetrically from left to right and top to bottom. So we'll be discussing different ways that artists can create asymmetrical balance as we move through this lecture. But this one is interesting because she's utilizing both of these different types of balance. So it kind of creates this really formal sense with the symmetrical balance of the skull mixed with a little bit more informal asymmetry of the background. So this piece is an exception to that artists never use symmetry rule. This is Damien Hirst's Posterity, the Holy Place from 2006. So if you look closely at this, you'll notice that this is pretty perfectly symmetrical. What he has done is he has taken actual butterflies and butterfly wings and arranged them in this really complex composition that mirrors or looks like a stained glass window that you might see in a Christian church. And he does this for a number of reasons. So when we think of symmetrical balance, it tends to make a piece very formal because of the fact that it doesn't necessarily have a lot of things that are changing from one aspect to another. So there's a sense of stability, of formality to it. And it's oftentimes used in religious art for that very reason, that it's this suggestion of something that is permanent, that is never changing, which you can see that religions would want to be associated with. Now we will see other religions also use symmetry in the artworks to create kind of a similar feel. So this piece is very different. This is a three-dimensional artwork, Shaka Triad, from 623, and in it we're seeing Buddha and two bodhisattvas, and they're arranged very symmetrically. And again, it's not perfect symmetry because of the mudras, the hand gestures of the figures, but for the most part we would call this a symmetrical composition. So when we look at this, it feels very regal, very formal, because of the fact that the figures are very stable, they don't look like they're moving, they're facing straight ahead, and they're, you know, perfectly balanced and perfectly symmetrical. And so that symmetry tends to imbibe the works with a sense of formality, a sense of permanence and stability. So as I mentioned before, asymmetrical balance is created through balancing objects on either side of an imaginary axis. And artists can do that in a number of different ways. So we're going to look at a few diagrams that help us explain how something is balanced visually. So in this first image, we can see that we have a large white oval on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we have a small white oval. So looking at this image, you would say, well, which one is heavier? The larger one is going to be heavier. So scale, the size of an object, can create a heavier visual weight. In this one, we have two ovals that are the same size. However, the one on the left is black and the one on the right is white. So when you look at these, hopefully you'll notice that the black one looks heavier. So the darker the tone, the darker the color, the heavier the visual weight. On this one, we have one side that is patterned on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, we have just that plain white oval. So another way you can think about visual weight is how long does it take for your eye to take in all of the information that you're seeing. And if it takes a long time, that's going to be a heavier visual weight. So the left-hand side, because it has that pattern, is going to take longer for your eye to kind of process all that information. Therefore, the one on the left is heavier. This one is kind of interesting because you have basically two ovals that are the same size. However, the one on the left is using negative space to create some interest there. So depending on kind of your thinking on this one, it could be either one that is heavier. So if we're just thinking about, like, if we put this on a scale, which one would be heavier? Well, the solid shape, the one on the right, would be heavier. However, if we went by the rule that I was just talking about with, how long does it take your eye to process the information, the one on the left would be heavier. So sometimes it can be subjective like that. Now this one, we have two smaller objects on the left-hand side versus one large object on the right-hand side, all the same color. And this is actually going to be equal. And that's because two smaller objects can balance one larger object. So again, think about putting this on an actual scale, and it should level out. This one too is equal. We have a smaller dark shape on the left-hand side versus a large light shape on the right-hand side. So we're kind of combining a couple of those rules, size and tone, in this one, and it equals out visually. So artists use these different basically balancing rules to create interesting compositions, and it also can add content to their works. So an artwork that uses this idea of asymmetrical balance is Gustav Klimt. This is his Death and Life from 1915. So this is pretty much exactly like that last diagram that we looked at, where we have the smaller dark shape on the left-hand side versus the larger light shape on the right-hand side. So we would say that this is balanced visually. It's a dramatic sort of balance, and your eye kind of continually moves back and forth between the two, but taking in the whole, it is balanced. And he does that for a specific reason. So if we look at the title, Death and Life, the subject matter is there in the title. We have death represented on the left with this figure that has been created out of these cool colors of blues, purples, and greens, and of course he has a skull for the head. And then on the right-hand side, we have life being represented with all of these different figures, different bright colors, warm colors, pinks, oranges, yellows. And it feels just much more alive and more inviting because of those warm colors. And when we think of cool colors, we think of sadness, melancholy, which definitely fits the figure on the left. So why would he choose to represent death like this, and why does he choose to represent life like this in this sort of asymmetrical balance? Well, we have to look at other things that are going on here. So if we take a look at the life side, you'll notice that there's one figure that stands out. She is in the kind of upper left-hand side of the life side, and you'll notice that she's the only figure with her eyes open, and she's kind of pointing to herself. And so you get the sense that death is coming for her, but she doesn't look frightened, she doesn't look scared, and none of the other figures are aware of death's presence. And so you get this sense that death is perhaps not something to be scared of, and it is, in a way, it's there to kind of balance out life. So without death, life could not continue. Right? We would just become overpopulated, etc. And so death is a necessary part of life for life to continue. And I think that's what he's saying in this work, and he does that through this use of extreme asymmetrical balance. Without that sort of balance, you wouldn't necessarily get that same message. That sort of dramatic asymmetrical balance was actually inspired by Japanese prints. This is Summer Rain by Hotsu from the 18th to 19th century. And this type of Japanese artwork was very, very influential to a lot of the early 20th century artists who were seeing it really for the first time. So in this one, you can see it's kind of a similar idea where you have all of this grass that's kind of on the bottom. Then you have this large white shape, and then this small dark blue organic river in the upper right hand corner. So this is balanced from both left to right and top to bottom. Again, but it's that very dramatic sense of balance between the small dark shape versus the large light shape, which is basically just the color of the paper that the artist is painting on. Here's another one, another Japanese print that we're seeing. This is from the 16th to 17th century, and it's called the Zen Priest Choka. So it's about a Zen priest, which is associated with Buddhism. And the artist is using a very dramatic sense of balance in this one. So if we take a look at how he's doing this, we will see that we have just a very light or a very small dark image of the Zen priest, and you can see that he's up in the tree. And then all of that, that tiny little black shape is balanced against all of this white open space of the rest of the composition. So again, it's that idea of the small dark shape versus the large light shape. So why would the artist choose to do that? Well, it's about this idea of, what Buddhism is and what you do in Buddhism. And one of the things that you do in Buddhism is you meditate. And during meditation, you're just trying to clear your mind. And really to become one with nature. And so we see this Zen priest out in nature, and then you have all of this open white space that's there to represent the how he's clearing his mind and this idea of meditation. And so again, we're seeing that use of very dramatic asymmetrical balance to create content within a work. So in this slide, you can see a comparison between the Shaka triad and death and life that we looked at earlier. You can see the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical balance in these two works. And so both of these works have a lot of visual interest. They both have pattern and texture. One is three-dimensional, one is two-dimensional. But the main difference is the use of balance. And so the symmetrical piece has a much more formal quality to it, a much more stable quality to it. Your eye kind of takes in the whole composition at once rather than, moving from left to right, back and forth again, which is what we do with death and life on the right-hand side. So it's this kind of constant movement created through this sense of balance, a very dramatic sense of asymmetrical balance. So we have this stable, balanced, symmetrical piece on the left, and then we have one that is a little bit more, it's still balanced, but it's going to be more dynamic and full of movement on the right-hand side. So this ends the second section to Chapter 5. In the next section, we will be looking at emphasis. This is section 3 of Chapter 5, the Principles of Design, in which we'll be discussing emphasis. So emphasis is when our attention is drawn to a certain part of the composition. And then focal point is going to be when we have a focused area of emphasis. So both of those can exist within a composition. So we can have an area of emphasis, and then we can have a focal point. And then we also have a term called subordination. And subordination is when parts of a composition are going to be created and to be less interesting on purpose, to draw our eye to where the artist wants us to look, or in other words, the area of emphasis. So basically, emphasis and subordination are opposites. And artists will use all of these tools in order to help them create content in their work. So we're looking at the Banjo Lesson by Henry Osawa Tanner from 1893. And in this work, we're seeing a grandfather give his grandson banjo lessons. And you can see them directly in the middle of the composition, and our eye is drawn to them immediately. So how is our eye drawn to them immediately? Well, one way is through unifying the figures in this group and creating this implied triangle that then becomes the largest shape within this composition. So the larger something is, the larger the shape is, the more our eye will be drawn to it. Another reason that our eye is drawn to the figures is because of the placement of the figures. They're directly in the middle of the composition, maybe cheated a little to the left, but pretty much right in the middle. And so you can kind of think of this as a target, and our eye is going to want to move directly to the middle of that target. Another thing is contrast. So contrast is defined when we have two very opposite things that are right next to each other. So in this case, we have the dark shape of the figures against the light white of the background. And so that contrast draws our eye because of the very difference, those very different tones. Another thing that is going to draw our eye to an area of emphasis is going to be at directional forces. And directional forces are paths our eyes follow to that are provided by actual or implied lines. So basically, if you see a line, your eye wants to follow it. And we do have some lines that are drawing our eye to the figures. So you can see the horizontal line of the table in the background. But really, when I'm talking about directional forces in this painting, I'm talking about how they're leading us to the focal point. And the focal point is the little boy's hand on the banjo. So let's go through this list on the left. We have size. So the banjo is the largest shape. Our eye's automatically drawn there. It's also in the middle of the grouping of the figures. So another reason our eye is drawn there. Contrast. We have the white banjo against the dark hand. So again, we have contrast that's drawing our eye there. And then the fourth reason our eye is drawn here is because of the directional forces. So if we look at the way the figures are looking, they're both looking down towards the boy's hand. That's going to lead our eye there. That anytime you see figures looking in a specific direction, that's a directional force. That's an implied line that's drawing your eye to where they're looking. We also have the diagonal line of the banjo's neck that is going to lead our eye directly to the boy's hand. So those are both directional forces that can be pretty strong. They're usually kind of subliminal, but the artist can make you look where he wants you to look by using directional forces. So why is Tanner emphasizing this group in the middle? Well, it's about more than a banjo lesson, right? It's about how the banjo lesson is unifying this family unit. So we have the two figures that are standing closely together, and they're both looking down at this hand, and that makes us realize what's going on, which is the banjo lesson, but then more importantly, how it's unifying the two figures and kind of solidifying their relationship into this really strong bond that is this implied triangle, right? So it's about creating the unity within a family. It goes beyond just the banjo lesson. And without emphasizing the figures and then the hand on the banjo, we wouldn't get that same content. In this one, we have multiple focal points. This is Still Life with Compatier, Picture and Fruit by Cezanne from 1892. So it's a still life in which we're seeing, just an arrangement of fruit and some ceramic dishes. The area of emphasis will be the still life arrangement. So we have the white cloth and all the colorful fruit against the more earthen toned background. So that's contrast. It's also right in the center. And it's also the largest shape. So all of those reasons that we talked about in the last image are here as well. Now within this area of emphasis, you'll have multiple focal points, which will be those bright fruits. And again, the groupings of fruits create larger shapes. It's also contrasting, with the white cloth and the earthen tone backgrounds. And so your eye is going to follow those fruits in kind of this circular motion around the still life. This is the Executions of the 3rd of May by Goya from 1814. And this one, we're seeing a very dramatic emphasis and focal point. So, if I were to ask you what is the area of emphasis here, hopefully you would say the man in white. And there's several reasons, right? So he's not directly in the center, but almost directly in the center of the composition. He's the largest shape because he has his hands up. So he's a little bit larger than the surrounding figures. He also has this really bright white shirt and yellow pants on that contrasts with everybody else's earthen toned clothing. So all of those reasons draw our eye to him. Now he's also the focal point. If you look at the directional forces, they're going to lead your eye to him. So we have the enemy soldiers on the right-hand side. All of them have their backs to us, so they've been subordinated. They've been made less interesting on purpose. And they're all pointing their guns at him, and you'll notice those guns create lines. So the lines are drawing our eye directly to the man in white there. I mentioned subordination of the figures. We also have subordination in the behind the man with this hill that's just kind of this dull brown. So our attention is meant to be drawn to him for a specific reason, right? We're supposed to be on his side. And you can see he has expression on his face. He's emotional. He's kind of pleading for his life. So he feels very human, very relatable. Whereas the soldiers, on the other hand, have their backs to us. They all look very similar, and they become almost robotic in that sense. So really we're meant to be on the side of the man who's being executed. And we'll talk more about this painting as we move through this course, but it is a very strong example of how an artist can use emphasis and focal point to create the area where he wants the viewer to look for a specific purpose. And in this case, it's to get us on his side. So this ends the section on emphasis. In the next section, we'll be looking at proportion and scale. This is the fourth section of Chapter 5, Principles of Design, in which we will discuss proportion and scale. So scale is a term that means size in relation to a norm or standard. Everything in the world has a kind of what we call a normal size. And so artists can choose to exaggerate size in order to create content. Now, on the other hand, we have proportion, and proportion is when we have size relationships between parts of a whole. So, for example, the head has a normal proportion to the body. So a body is usually about 8.5 heads long. So that's just an example of proportion. And artists can exaggerate proportion, change proportion in order to create content. This work is called Shuttlecocks by Klaus Oldenburg and Chpt Jan Bruggen from 1994. Now, Klaus Oldenburg is an artist who is known for exaggerating scale within his artworks to create content. So these objects that we're looking at are usually about 3 or 4 inches tall. They usually fit in your, the palm of your hand. And in this case, he has given us these really exaggerated, large versions of that tiny object. These are about 17 feet tall. They're just massive. And you can see that they're placed in different positions along this really grand sweeping lawn. And they're placed in front of a very austere building. You can see the building in the bottom image. The building itself is in this neoclassical style. It's very symmetrical, which means it's very, dignified, very, very serious. And so there's a real contrast there between that serious building and then this really playful sculpture out front. And so there's a number of things that Klaus Oldenburg could be trying to do by exaggerating scale here. One thing is that we tend to look at the object differently. So we'll look at it not necessarily as an object, but as an art piece. And because of that, we'll pay attention to things like how the object is put together, the way the feathers overlap, how they go into the tip, how it's all put together with the string around the middle. And those things you wouldn't necessarily think about if you were just playing badminton with a birdie. You wouldn't take it and analyze it like that. But because you're seeing it larger, really larger than a human, you're going to pay attention to those things. Another thing that he's doing in this particular piece is again, calling into contrast between that austere, serious building and this really playful art piece, is the idea that art doesn't always have to be so serious. So we're seeing the building itself is actually the Kansas City Museum of Art, and you can see it was done in this way to create, it was created in this very symmetrical neoclassical style to emphasize the seriousness and the importance of the building. But Klaus Oldenburg is saying that art doesn't always have to be so serious. It can be fun. It can be lighthearted. And so we see like we're almost seeing like a Giants game of badminton where they're kind of dropping all of these birdies all over the lawn, and we're kind of seeing it right in the midst of that. So it's a pretty fun piece. This is a piece called Royal Altar to the Hand from the Benin culture in Africa from the 18th century. In this work, we can see both scale and proportion being used to create content. So first of all, I want to draw your attention to scale. If you look at the figures in the kind of the middle part of the piece there, that are in that middle register standing side by side, you'll notice that some figures appear to be larger than other figures. In particular, the middle figure is the largest, so he's both taller and wider than the other figures. So that's an exaggeration of scale, and it's meant to draw our attention to him and also to make him feel like he is the most important figure. When an artist is using this type of scale, exaggerating scale according to the importance of the figure, that is called hierarchical scale. So hierarchical scale is being used here to draw our attention to that middle figure because he is the king. Now, if you look at the king's figure, you'll notice that his head is very large in proportion to the rest of his body. So if you can compare his head to the size of his torso, and you'll see that they're about equal, and then look at your torso and imagine your head being that big. So it's obviously a very large head. So there's reasons that the artist would choose to do that. If you think about the head, what the head is and what it represents, we think with our head, with our brain, and so the larger the head, perhaps they're indicating that the king has a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom. It also makes him feel, his scale and the proportion of his head makes him feel powerful. And so by exaggerating scale and proportion, we get the sense that this king is very powerful and very wise and knowledgeable at the same time. All characteristics that you would want your king to have. And so when we see figures like this exaggerated in these ways, it's actually a form of propaganda to make people see him the way that the king wants to be represented, not necessarily as he actually looks. This is the last image that we'll look at in this section. This is Resurrection by El Greco from 1600 to 05. So this is a Christian-themed painting in which we're seeing the resurrection of Christ as he is ascending into heaven. And the artist is using a type of exaggeration of proportion called elongation. So in elongation, the artist is going to be creating elongated figures. So figures that feel taller and more slender than they actually are or should be. And you can see that very clearly when you look at the figure of Christ. He's very thin and very, very tall. And the other figures are like that too. And the artist is choosing to represent Christ in this way because he wants him to feel weightless. He's floating, he's ascending into heaven. And so he wants him to feel weightless because of that floating quality. And so therefore, he's using this technique called elongation. That ends this section of Chapter 5, The Principles of Design. In the next and last section, we will be looking at rhythm. This is the fifth and final section of Chapter 5, The Principles of Design, in which we will be discussing rhythm. Rhythm is the result of repetition in a composition, and repetition is just when you have repeated visual elements, and what that does is it's going to give a composition unity, continuity, flow, emphasis, and definitely movement. This piece is called Broadway Boogie Woogie, and it's by an artist named Pete Mondrian from 1942 to 43. Now, Mondrian moved to the United States during the 1920s, and he lived in New York City, and he was just amazed with the music scene there, in particular jazz. And so that's kind of the inspiration behind this painting. Now, what I want you to first look at is what is being repeated here. What is the repetition? So we can see repeated shapes. We see lots of rectangles and squares. The entire composition is a square. You also see line. You see horizontal and vertical lines. And then, of course, you see color. The colors that he's repeating are the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. And he's using this repetition to create mood, movement, and just really the feeling of that jazz that he was so fond of. So if I were to ask you to describe this rhythm, you might use words like fast, loud, happy. You would not say that this is a slow rhythm or a sad rhythm. And that is because the type of repetition that we have is rapid. In other words, we see lots of small little squares placed next to each other. The colors that he's using are bright and happy, cheerful colors, red, yellow, and blue. And so by creating this fast and happy rhythm, he is trying to emulate this boogie-woogie style of jazz. Another thing that a lot of people say that this reminds them of is traffic patterns, like if you were looking at an aerial shot of a city looking down at the ground. You might say that this looks like a street grid, and then the larger shapes are buildings, perhaps. And that could be valid. You know, it is called Broadway Boogie Woogie, so maybe he is referencing Broadway as well as the jazz scene. This is Landscape with Yellow Birds by Paul Klee from 1923. In this work, we're actually seeing multiple types of repetition and rhythm. And what the rhythm does in this case is gives the painting movement and helps draw your eye around the painting. So first of all, you can see that we have these four kind of large, white, oblong, organic forms that kind of resemble leaves. And you can see how that divides the composition into five parts. And it helps your eye kind of give you a stopping point as you're moving across the composition, like if you're reading it from left to right. You kind of stop and take in each space as you're moving across the composition. Secondly, you're going to notice how we have yellow birds strategically placed throughout the composition, and you'll see that it's almost in the circular form or oval form in which we're seeing these yellow birds. And again, our eye is going to move from bird to bird as it kind of connects those forms. Next, we have these organic kind of plant forms that, again, help our eye move around the painting. You can see that they kind of scoop around the bottom part of that painting. And then you have these two circles that are kind of in the middle of the painting that kind of give your eye this point to rotate around. So all in all, we're going to have a really circular sense of motion within this painting. But even if you looked at it from left to right, you're still going to have these individual stopping points. So an artwork that could be kind of muddled because there's so much variety here. We have variety in terms of color, texture, shape, space, just all kinds of things represented here. Because of the way that he's repeated certain shapes and forms, it gives it unity and it helps create a controlled movement around the painting instead of being chaotic. So in summation, these principles of design will help you determine content in a work of art. So at the end of chapter 4, I asked you guys to discuss this painting and to look and see which elements stood out and why. So I'm going to have you guys do another discussion for me in which we talk about principles of design and how the artist is using them. And then I want you to think about how the artist is using both elements and principles of design to create content, and what exactly this painting means, or what maybe some possible meanings of this painting might be. So look for that discussion on Blackboard, and this ends Chapter 5. Thank you.